Good day everyone. In this video, I will discuss about the intellectual revolutions that define society. So this section reviews the intellectual revolutions that change the way people perceive the influence of science on society in general. So it focuses on the three of the most important intellectual revolutions in the history, which are the Copernican, Darwinian, and then the Freudian. So by this discussion, the intellectual revolutions in the context of science, technology, and society, the attention of the students are drawn again toward the complex interplay of the various social contexts and then the development of the modern science. So in this section, it also engages students in a critical analysis of ongoing intellectual and scientific revolutions which they may find themselves to be part of. So at the end of this discussion, the students, or you should be able to identify the intellectual revolutions that shape society across time, and you are going to explain how the intellectual revolutions transform the views of society about dominant scientific thought. And the last one is you are going to research on other intellectual revolutions that advance modern science and scientific thinking. Okay, so in this area, interest lies in how intellectual revolutions emerge as a result of the interaction of science and technology and of that society. So it also covers how the intellectual revolutions altered the way modern science was understood and approached. So in science and technology, the definition of intellectual revolution refers to the series of events that led to the emergence of modern science and the progress of scientific thinking across critical periods in history. So, what do we mean by revolutions? Let us define first what revolutions is. So, revolution, it denotes a drastic change in what is established, believed, and embraced by the society. So as I mentioned a while ago, that this discussion focuses only on the three most important intellectual revolutions. So we have the Copernican, Darwinian, and then the Freudian Revolution. So dyan lang tayo magpo-focus ng discussion about the intellectual revolutions that define society. Okay. So first, let us discuss the Copernican Revolution. So the Copernican Revolution, it refers to the 16th century paradigm shift named after the Polish mathematician and astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus. So Nicolaus Copernicus, considered as the father of modern astronomy. So siya yung kinonsider as the father of modern astronomy because of this Copernican Revolution. So Copernicus formulated the heliocentric model. So ito yung nasa likod niya. This is the heliocentric model of the universe. He formulated the heliocentric model of the universe, introducing it in a 40-page outline entitled Commentariolus. He also formalized his model in the publication of his treatise, The Revolution Celestial Spheres, in 1543. So in his model, Copernicus repositioned the Earth from the center of the solar system and introduced the idea that the Earth rotates on its own axis. So the idea that the sun is at the center of the universe instead of the earth proved to be unsettling to many scientists when Copernicus first introduced his model. So nagkaroon din ng mga controversies about this Copernican revolution. So why is it that the sun, according to Copernicus, the sun is at the center of the universe instead of the earth? So in fact, the heliocentric model was met with huge resistance, lalong-lalo na sa church, and accusing him of heresy. So inakusahan siya ng heresy because of that thinking. So at that time, the idea was not the earth, and by the extension not man, that was the center of all creation was unthinkable. So si Copernicus is nagharap sa isang persecution from the church because of that idea. Parang hindi matanggap ng church, lalo-lalo na yung church na yung center ng universe is sun, which is not. Kasi yun yung model ni Nicolas Copernicus. So, moreover, although far more sensible than the Ptolemaic model, which as early as the 13th century had been criticized for its shortcomings, the Copernican model also had multiple inadequacies that were later filled in by astronomers who participated in the revolution. So, based from this revolution, sabi dito na almost 100 years bago matanggap ng ilang scientists yung theory ni Copernicus. So, it took almost 100 years before Copernicus theory formally gained respect and recognition. At dahil yun sa mga further explorations ng iba't ibang mga scientists. At isa na dito si Galileo Galilei. So, despite problems with the model and the persecution of the church, the heliocentric model was soon accepted by other scientists of the time, especially by Galileo Galilei. And of course, isa rin sa mga nag-explore ng theory ni Copernicus is Isaac Newton. He was the first one to provide mathematical equations that could prove that Copernicus, Brahe, and Kepler tried to explain. Okay, so the contribution of Copernican Revolution served as a catalyst to sway scientific thinking away from age-long views about position of the Earth relative to an enlightened understanding of the universe. So, from that point, it also marked a turning point in the study of cosmology and astronomy, making it truly important intellectual revolution. So, habang tumatagal, habang mas lalong nag-explore yung iba't ibang scientists about the revolution, about the Copernican Revolution, mas nagkakaroon ng importansya itong Copernican Revolution, especially in the intellectual revolution. Okay. So let's proceed to the Darwinian Revolution. So Darwinian Revolution, yung proponent naman ng revolution na to is si Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin, he was an English naturalist, geologist, and biologist who credited for steering another important intellectual revolution in the mid-19th century, which is called the Darwinian Revolution. So he was also considered as the father of evolution. So yung meron siyang book na it was entitled The Origin of the Species. So he published this book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. So what is that natural selection? So In natural selection, it is a process where species that adapt to the changing environment survive, whereas those that do not simply die out, these are manifested in offspring that are more fit and well suited to the challenges of survival and reproduction. So, yung Darwin's findings were scrutinized by experts. So, some of them actually, the Darwin's theory of evolution was of course met with resistance and considered to be controversial. Same with Copernicus Revolution. Parang nagkaroon din ng mga controversies regarding about this Darwinian revolution. Critics accuse the theory of being either short in accounting for the broad and complex evolutionary process, or dismissive of the idea that the functional design of organisms was a manifestation of omniscient God. So this this Darwinian revolution can be likened to the theory of Copernicus, the Copernican Revolution, in its demonstration of the power of the laws of nature in explaining biological phenomena of survival and reproduction. So, kumbaga, yung focus nitong Darwinian Revolution is for survival and reproduction. So, the place of the Darwinian Revolution in modern science cannot be underestimated. So, through this revolution, the development of organisms and origin of the unique forms of life and humanity could be rationalized by lawful system, or it is considered as an orderly process of change underpinned by laws of nature. Okay, so Darwin he organized, he was containing this, the Darwinian Revolution is actually more on survival and then reproduction, with the help of with the process of change underpinned by laws of nature. So yun yung tungkol kay Darwinian Revolution. So in that point, sabi ko kanina that it is same as Copernican Revolution in a way that they get some critics from the people, yung hindi matanggap yung mga yung revolution na yan. But Darwin's theory of biological evolution, also known as Darwinism, paved the way not only for developments in evolutionary biology, but also served as the foundation of the philosophy of biology. So that's all about the Darwinian Revolution. It is more on survival and reproduction, as I said a while ago. And the next intellectual revolutions is the Freudian Revolution. So in this Freudian Revolution, the proponent of this revolution is Sigmund Freud. He was an Austrian neurologist, and he was credited for a 20th century intellectual revolution named after him, the Freudian Revolution. So the Freudian Revolution was named by the Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud was also considered as the father of psychoanalysis. So he was considered as the father of psychoanalysis. He developed psychoanalysis. So it is a scientific method of understanding inner and unconscious conflicts embedded with one personality, springing from free associations, dreams, and fantasies of the individual. So, in this revolution, Sigmund Freud also, or the psychoanalysis immediately shot into controversy for its emphasized the existence of the unconscious. The unconscious, where feelings, thoughts, urges, emotions, and memories are contained outside of one's conscious mind. So the psychoanalytic concept of psychosocial development, libido, and ego were met with both support and resistance from many scholars. So Freudian revolution, or Freud's psychoanalysis, is anchored on the concept that human behavior is determined by unconscious motivation. So his theory about psychoanalysis determined by unconscious motivations and biological and instinctive drives that support the idea that human beings have no real ability to make choices and control life event. So drives or instincts are the recurring concept in Freud's theory. So according to him, there are two conflicting main instincts. We have the eros and then the thanatos. So we have the eros and then the thanatos. The eros refers to the life instinct, and then the thanatos refers to the death instinct. So let us look at the picture. In this picture, you can see that from eros there is an angel, and then from thanatos there is a devil. Because in eros, it is the life instinct according to Sigmund Freud. So syempre, it determines the procreation, social cooperation, and then survival. While itong thanatos, it involves aggression, risky behavior, and relieving trauma. So that instinct itong thanatos. So let us further explain about the difference between the eros and then the thanatos. So eros, it refers to the survival instinct involving basic hunger, thirst, and sexual impulses. Sometimes, eros referred to as sexual instinct. The life instincts are those which deal with basic survival, pleasure, and then the reproduction. While the thanatos refers to the aggressive and self-destructive instinct driven toward death. So kaya nga death instinct si thanatos. So the concept of the death instinct was initially prescribed in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which Freud proposed that the goal of all life is death. So Freud continued to develop multiple theories, including his theorization on the structures of personality. So there are three structure of personality that Freud's developed. So this theory describes how people act according to different systems of personality. So the human personality, according to Freud, is actually complex, as it has more than a single component. So there, as I've said a while ago, that there are three personality that Freud's developed. Personality structure that Freud's developed. The first one is the id. The second one is the ego, which is the reality. And then the third one is the superego, which is the morality. So let us all discuss each personality structure that was Freud developed. So let us proceed to the id, or the instincts. So according to him, it is the unconscious aspect of the personality that includes untamed instincts, impulses, and desires. So, untamed instincts, impulses, and desires. So, it is said to be present since birth and operates by the pleasure principle that requires immediate gratification of all desires, of all the desires, wants, and needs to avoid feeling anything other than pleasure. Okay. So it does not actually mature and resides within every individual as he or she ages. So parang na-control din naman itong id na to as he or she grows. Next is by the way, id is what we call the pleasure principle. So tandaan po. And then the ego, which is the reality. So what about the ego? What is the meaning of ego according to Freud? So it is the structure of personality that is responsible for dealing with reality. So the ego functions as the referee that balance the id against demands and expectations of society. So it refers as the referee between id and then the superego. Kumbaga siya yung nagbabalance kung ano ba yung dapat na gawin. And it controls and regulates a person in accordance with the outside world and is ruled by the reality principle, which maintains realistic and logical thinking to satisfy one's need in socially acceptable manner. So in socially acceptable manner. So ego is the reality principle, id is the pleasure principle. Next one is the superego. So according to Freud, it is the judicial structure of the personality that holds all the internalized moral standards and ideals that are acquired from close relationships, environment, and then the society. So the superego is the sense of right and wrong that provides the guidelines for making judgments and anchored on one's established moral standard. So according to Freud, the superego is comprised of two parts, the ego ideal and then the conscience ego. The ego ideal includes, we have the ego ideal and then the conscience. The conscience ego rather. So when we say ego ideal, it includes the rules and standards for good behavior one has learned from his or her parents and other figures of authority. It is also known as the ideal self, while the conscience ego, which leaves room for self-evaluation and criticism, is ruled by a reward and punishment system. So it is responsible for the sense of guilt one feels when acting wrongly according to the superego. The superego works regardless of perceived consequences or benefits, and sometimes it does not maintain the idea of the end justifies the means. So the end justifies the means. So let's have some example of the three personality structure that Freud's developed. So if we are going to summarize this, id is the energy constantly striving to satisfy basic drives. This is the pleasure principle. And then ego seeks to gratify the id in realistic ways, the reality principle. And then the superego, it is a voice of conscience that focuses on how we ought to behave, or that is the morality principle. So we have the pleasure principle, reality principle, and then the morality principle. So another, innate desires, pleasure-seeking, aggression, sexual impulse under the id. Superego, moral, ethical, values, parental. And then the ego, mature and adapted behavior. So one of the example is, look at this picture. So sabi ni id, I want it now. So kung ano yung gusto makuha ni id, gusto niyang kunin. But sabi ni superego, you can't have it because it is not right. So yun naman, that is from moral, ethical values. Si id is for pleasure seeking. Kung ano yung makita, kukunin. And kahit na mali, kukunin. Then si superego, siya yung nagsasabi, dyan na papasok yung conscience ng isang tao. Dyan papasok si superego na sasabihin niya, you can't have it, it's not right. And kapag nagsalita na si id, tapos nagsalita na si superego, ego was there. Siya yung nagbabalance kung ano ba yung dapat gawin. So, I need to do a bit of planning to get it. So, paano ba natin siya makukuha na hindi ka magkakaroon ng fault, and makukuha mo siya with just a bit of planning to get that object. So another example is here. So yung scenario dito sa first example is nakakita ka ng chocolate sa isang store, and sabi ni id, I want to eat chocolate. So yung pleasure mo na kumain ng chocolate is dito papasok kay id, na gustong-gusto mong kumain ng chocolate. But sabi ni superego, since that is a chocolate, you need to have a diet. So you are on a diet. So I am on a super diet. So how are you going to balance that two? Kung gustong-gusto makuha ni id, and then ito naman nagsasabi na you're on a diet. So dito na rin papasok si ego, na sabi ni ego, makakakain ka nun, pero just a small bar of chocolate. So hindi mo pwedeng ubusin yung chocolate na yun. At kung gusto mong kumain na nagda-diet ka, you just eat a small bar of chocolate. Okay, so this is one of the example of the personality structure that Freud developed. And another example is here. So we have the dynamic equilibrium. So yung scenario dito, exams are approaching. So what should you do? What are you going to do? Sabi ni id, do no revision and socialize. Sige, wag kang mag-review, makipag-socialize ka lang sa mga kaibigan mo, uminom kayo, mag-party-party kayo, sabi ni id. While the superego said, do nothing but revision. Wala kang ibang gagawin kundi mag-review. Mag-review ka lang at mag-review ka lang. Wala ka ng time for relaxation. So go lang, review lang. At dito napapasok si ego. This is the dynamic equilibrium. So binabalance ni ego yung kagustuhan ni id and kagustuhan ni superego. So it revises with a realistic revision timetable. So meron siyang ginawang kailan lang siya magre-review at kailan din siya magre-relax. So by relaxing, doon papasok si id, and by magre-review, doon papasok si superego. So merong time na sinusunod kumbaga. So nagkakaroon ng time management between that. Doon papasok si superego. So binabalance niya yung kagustuhan ni id and then yung kagustuhan ni superego. And another example is ito. You are on a department store and meron isang cart na lang or isang shopping cart na lang ang nandoon, and may babae na kumuha ng cart na yun, and ikaw naman gusto mo rin kasi marami kang bibilhin sa department store, kaya gusto mo rin na magkaroon ng shopping cart, pero isa na lang yung natitira. So sabi ni id, Go ahead and fight over the shopping cart. Show M who's the boss. So puntahan mo yung babae, then makipag-away ka, sabi ni Id. Siya yung nagtutulak sa inyo para makipag-away. Well, sabi naman ni Superego, fighting over something as trivial as a shopping cart. So very, very moral nga yung sinasabi niya. Is it a manifestation of pretty idiotic egotism? So yun yung mga sinasabi ni Superego. At andito si Ego again. Sabi ni Ego, are you sure you want to fight over a silly shopping cart? So anong mangyayari kapag kipag-away ka because of that shopping cart na gusto mo makuha? So yun yung nagbabalance kay Id, si Ego. So that is the explanation between the three personality structure that Freud developed. So yun yung tatlo, the id, ego, superego. So kung may gagawin kang isang bagay na gustong-gusto mo, yung nagpa-function sa'yo is yung id, kahit na mali yung gagawin. And si superego marirealize mo lang after mo magawa or sometimes during ginagawa mo yung bagay na yun. And after nun, dito na papasok uli si superego na tama ba yung ginawa? Ano ba yung mga nangyari? Kasi nagawa mo yung isang bagay na yun. So yun yung explanation sa personality structure of Sigmund Freud. So, there are some scientists na nag-evolve of Freud's psychoanalysis na mas pinag-aralan nila yung tungkol sa theory ni Sigmund Freud. One of this is si Carl Jung. So, Carl Jung, who is known for the development of analytical psychology, a branch of psychotherapy, was an early supporter of Freud because of their shared belief in the unconscious. So, siya si Carl Jung. He also coined the terms introvert and then extrovert. So, ano ba yung difference between introvert and extrovert? So, under introvert, it prefers spending time in solitude, while sa extrovert, have large social networks. So when it comes to socialization, mas gusto ni introvert na mag-spend time with herself, while kapag ikaw naman ay isang extrovert na person, you have large social networks. And next is, sa introvert, it avoid being the center of attention. So, ayaw niya na siya ang center of attention. While sa extrovert naman, nai-enjoy niya being the center of attention. And under introverts, I think before they speak. So, pinag-iisipan muna nila yung mga sasabihin nila. While the extrovert tend to think out loud. So, kung ano yung nasa isip nila, sinasabi lang nila. They are thinking out loud. So they speak before they think. And when it comes to value close, so value close 1:1 relationships. While dito sa extrovert loves being in a large groups. So dito okay lang sa kanya na isa lang yung friend niya. While sa extrovert, mas madaming group of people, mas masaya yung sa extrovert. Loves being in a large group of friendships. And under introvert, need time alone to recharge and reflect. So, mas gusto niya na mapag-isa siya para maka-recharge and reflect siya. While the extrovert, it gain energy from being around other people. So, they gain energy from being around other people. So, mas focus sila kapag maraming tao yung nakapalibot sa kanila. Pero ito naman si introvert, mas gusto niya yung alone lang siya, mag-isa siya, mas nakakapag-focus siya. And introvert, he prefer working in a quiet, independent environment. So mas gusto niya na tahimik, independent environment. While extrovert, mas gusto niya na team-oriented. Mas gusto niya na marami yung nakakasalamuhan niya in terms of work. Okay. Next is deeply focus and think about a specific interest. So, before he or she decide kung ano yung gusto niya, pinag-iisipan muna niya ito. And talagang yung focus niya is napaka-deep about specific interest. For example, kung gusto niya ba maglaro ng isang bagay, kung gusto niya ba pumunta sa isang lugar, so he or she deeply focus and think about that. While extrovert, go lang ng go. Make quick decisions. Parang, tara, punta tayo kung saan. Then go. So, he make quick decisions. And lastly, can be seen as reserved. While extrovert, outgoing, enthusiastic, and then positive. So that is the difference between introverts and then extrovert person. So are you introvert or are you extrovert? So next scientist is Albert Adler. So he developed his own method, individual psychology, using a holistic approach to study a person's character. So he rejected Freud's theory on the psychosexual aspect of personality. So si Albert Adler, dinevelop niya yung own method, individual psychology, using a holistic approach to study para pag-aralan yung character ng isang tao. He also rejected Freud's theory on the psychosexual aspect of personality. And we have Erik Eriksson. Erik Eriksson accepted Freud's psychosexual development theory, but he modified it as a psychosocial theory. So according to this theory, in each stage of development, there is a psychosocial task that a person must master to feel a sense of competence. So may mga psychosocial tasks na kailangan ma-master ng isang tao para ma-feel niya yung sense of competence. He is known for coining the terms identity crisis, and we will discuss it in the next slide. Okay. So this is the Eriksson stages of psychosocial development. So let us first discuss each psychosocial crisis or task. So the first step or the first stage, we have the infant to 18 months. So infancy, birth to 18 months. So the basic conflict is the trust versus mistrust. So yung pag na-develop yung psychosocial task dito, merong made-develop na virtue, which is hope. So the important events in this stage is feeding. So kailangan yung children develop a sense of trust when, for example, when the caregivers or your mother provide reliability, care, and affection. So kapag a lack of that will lead to mistrust. So kailangan yung children makadevelop ng trust sa mother or sa kung sino man yung mag-aalaga sa kanya, to provide reliability, care, and affection. So kung hindi yun ma-develop sa kanya, it will lead to chest. The next stage is 18 months to 3 years. 3 years old. So the basic conflict or the psychosocial crisis or task here is the autonomy versus shame or doubt. So if the psychosocial crisis and task was developed, was done, the virtue developed here is will. So autonomy versus shame or doubt, we have will. So yung important events under this stage is kailangan marunong na yung bata na mag-toilet training. So dito, tinitraining na sila sa paggamit ng CR. So children need to develop a sense of personal control over physical skills and a sense of independence. So success leads to feelings of autonomy. So kapag nag-success yun, the children might feel autonomy, to the feel of autonomy. While failure of that result, failure doon sa toilet training for instance, the children feelings of shame and doubt. So parang hindi masasatisfy yung bata sa hindi siya masasatisfy kapag hindi na perfect yung pagtitrain sa kanya doon. And the next stage is from 3 to 5 years old. So the psychosocial crisis or task here is the initiative versus guilt. So the virtue developed here is purpose. So we have purpose. So dito, the important events under this stage is yung exploration. So children need to begin asserting control and power over the environment. Success in this stage leads to a sense of purpose. Children who try to exert too much power experience disapproval, resulting in a sense of guilt. So kailangan dito gabay ng parent pa rin na kapag hindi naging successful yung stage na to, it leads to a sense of guilt. So habang buhay na yun sa bata. And the next stage is school age. So 5 to 13 years old. Industry versus inferiority. And then the virtue developed here is competency. So dito, yung important event dito sa next stage is yung school. So dapat yung bata need to cope with new social and academic demands. So kailangan niya na mag-cope with makasalamuhan na siya ng mga ng iba't ibang tao inside the school. Say for example, with new social and academic demands. So kapag naging success yung children doon, yung child doon, it leads to a sense of competence, while failure results in a feelings of inferiority. So yun. Next stage is 13 to 21 years old. So that is from adolescence na. So the important event here is yung social relationships. So we have the identity versus role confusion or the confusion. So dito, since adolescence ito, yung virtue na madadevelop pag naging successful yung identity mo dito is fidelity. So kadalasan yung mga teens na yung nandito. So teens need to develop a sense of self and personal identity. So kailangan malaman na nila kung ano yung personality nila. Success leads to an ability to stay true to yourself. So maging totoo ka na dito sa sarili mo, while failure leads to role confusion and a weak sense of self. So dito parang kapag nag-fail ka under this stage, dito mo na ma-feel yung weak sense of self sa sarili mo. Okay, so ano ba yung parang role mo as teen kung hindi ka magiging successful under this stage. Pero kapag naging successful ka under this stage, it will leads to an ability to stay true to yourself. And next is the young adulthood, 21 to 39 years old. So this is intimacy and then isolation. So dito sa intimacy versus isolation, the important events under this is the relationship. So relationship. So kailangan yung virtue na ma-develop dito is love. So young adults need to form intimate, loving relationship with other people. So parang dito na naghahanap ng love sa boy or girl. So kumbaga intimate relationship na yung mafe-feel dito ng boy at saka ng girl. Success leads to strong relationship while failure results in loneliness and isolation. So kaya may mga times na kapag halimbawa nag-court yung isang boy sa isang girl, kapag nag-fail siya sa part na yon, kapag hindi siya kapag hindi nag-yes yung girl sa boy, sometimes it leads to loneliness and isolation. Kaya very critical din itong stage na to, because papasok ka na sa intimate relationship tinatawag. So kapag nag-success naman yung pag-court ng isang boy sa isang girl, then it leads to a strong relationship. Pero kapag nag-fail yun, sometimes it leads to loneliness and sometimes isolation. Parang ayaw niya na kasi na hindi siya nag-fail siya sa pag-court sa girl. Okay. Next is the under 40 to 65 years old. So this is the middle adulthood. So under this, generativity versus stagnation. So the important events under this is yung work and parenthood. So dito, sometimes ito na yung kapag nag-success dito under this stage, may virtue na ma-develop, which is care. So adults need to create or nurture things that will outlast them, often by having children or creating a positive change that benefits other people. So success leads to the feelings of usefulness and accomplishment. So kapag nag-success ka dito under this stage, kasi yung important events mo na dito is yung pagiging isang nanay at isang tatay, and kung meron ka bang work doon. So you are having a children or creating a positive change that benefits other people. So success leads to feelings of usefulness and accomplishment. Pero kapag nag-fail ka doon, it results in shallow involvement in the world. Bakit? Bakit Nea? Bakit hindi wala kang ganito? Bakit ganyan? Okay, so ganun na yung mafe-feel ng tao under this stage kapag nag-fail siya. Pero kapag nag-success naman, it will lead to usefulness and accomplishment. And the last stage is yung maturity, 65 years old and older. So dito yung mga lola at lolo na. So integrity versus despair. So the virtue developed here under this stage is the wisdom. So dito magre-reflect na about life. So older adults need to look back on life and feel a sense of fulfillment. Kung nagawa ba nila yung mga bagay na dapat nilang gawin, then success at this stage leads to feeling of wisdom, while failure results in regret, bitterness, and despair. So kapag hindi nila nagawa yung kailangan nilang gawin nung dati pa, parang they go back to whatever deeds na ginawa nila, yung mga things na ginawa nila, kung nag-success ba sila or kung hindi. And kapag Kapag nag-success at that stage, it leads to the feelings of wisdom. While kapag na-fail, it regrets to bitterness and despair. So habang buhay nila yun, dadamdamin, especially kapag yung mga lola at lolo baga. So ganun. So parang nagiging nagkakaroon na ng pagsisisi din. Bakit di nila nagawa yung isang bagay na yun? Okay. So that is all about the psychosocial development of Eriksson theory. So we already discussed about the 3 intellectual revolutions that define society. We have again the Copernican Revolution, the Darwinian Revolution, and then the Freudian Revolution. So by that 3, we already know what is actually the importance of that intellectual. Bakit kailangan natin pinag-aaralan yung mga intellectual revolutions na yun. Then, how did that revolution advance modern science and scientific thinking at that time? So, we already determine or explain how that intellectual revolutions transformed the views of society about dominant scientific thought. And yung tatlong revolution na yun are very important in the study of society. So that is all about the discussion of intellectual revolution and society. Okay, thank you and God bless.